My name is Isa Shivji. I am the director of Yara Resource Center and previously the professor of University of Dar es Salaam and also Mwalimu Nyerere Chair in Pan-African Studies. We invited Professor Prabhat Patnaik from India. He's emeritus professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. And he gave a Nyerere dialogue lecture and also shared his experience of planning with our directors and planners from various ministries in Dodoma. And today on Saturday he gave a lecture on the idea of a university to the university community and on Mwalimu Nyerere campus, University of Dar es Salaam. And today we are very happy to have the professor to have a conversation with us at UONGOZI Institute. Professor, welcome. Since you have been here, you gave 3 lectures. You gave a lecture on capitalism, socialism, and petty production or small production at the Nyerere Research Institute Center. And then you gave a lecture in Dodoma to the directors and planners from various ministries on your experience of the State Planning Board of Kerala. And then today, you gave a lecture at the University of Dar es Salaam on the idea of a university. Now, I want to start with small producers, meaning basically peasants, fishermen, pastoralists, and so on in our countries. Now, the traditional or the mainstream view is that small production is backward, is inefficient, is unproductive. It uses outdated implements, and we are in a hurry to develop, we are in a hurry to catch up, and therefore we cannot simply rely on small production. We have to introduce large-scale production to get results. In fact, in Tanzania we had a program called Big Results Now. Okay. So you should have large-scale agriculture production. I would like to get your opinion on this, particularly from the point of view of political economy, of which you are a professor, and also from the point of view of a kind of historical understanding of this path of development.
You know, firstly, the idea of small production being inefficient itself is questionable, certainly when it comes to agriculture, because peasant agriculture is one which is not necessarily inefficient except for the fact that it has very low labor productivity. If you're looking at land productivity, which is the more important thing to look at, there is no obvious reason why large-scale farming or capitalist farming is any better than small-scale farming, because after all that depends on provision of irrigation, better seeds and so on, which can be all used on small farms. Now, when it comes to labor productivity, the other side of labor productivity being higher is that employment is smaller. As a result, always the substitution of small production by large-scale production, particularly in agriculture, which is the real center for petty production, gives rise to a displacement of population. Therefore, this idea of us being in a hurry, and therefore let us go in for large-scale production, even if I forget about the efficiency argument, might make sense if the people from the small production sector who are displaced by this could be absorbed into the capitalist sector. Now, there is a belief that they would be absorbed, and there's a belief that historically this is what happened. But as a matter of fact, when you look at historically what did happen, you find that capitalism never really absorbed all those who were displaced. 2 things happened. Firstly, those who were displaced from...
You're talking about European
experience, yeah. Because historical experience mainly relates to Europe. You know, so when the European small producers who were displaced, a lot of them migrated to the New World. About 50 million people migrated from Europe between, let's say, 1815 and 1914. So in the New World, they got rid of the existing population, got hold of land, set themselves up as farmers, etc. So it's not as if capitalism in Europe absorbed them. Then as far as the other part of small producers displaced by European capitalism is concerned, that occurred in the colonies, in or semi-colonies like India and China. And they were never absorbed into anything. They simply stayed on in their traditional habitats, constituting a sort of impoverished mass, unemployed, underemployed, impoverished mass. So this idea that capitalism absorbs those who are displaced from the petty production sector is something which is not historically correct. And even theoretically, it's the case that since capitalism is associated with continuous technological progress, the rate of growth of employment that it generates is too low compared even to the rate of population and therefore workforce growth, let alone absorb people who are getting displaced from other sectors. So I think this way of looking at development is really one which is not very fruitful, because this way of looking at development may mean that even if you have high rates of growth, you would have continuous, even worsening poverty and underemployment accompanying this high growth trajectory. So I think third world countries today, for whom migration possibilities are not open, cannot afford to pursue this path.
Okay, so you are saying that basically in the third world countries we have no possibility of exporting our surplus population.
That's right, exactly.
Okay, which Europe did. So what do you do with the displaced people? Now, but the question I want to ask, if I may play devil's advocate, these days the multinational corporations and capital have come up with an argument that we did not displace peasant production, but we should improve peasant production. And therefore we have things like outgrower schemes. We have whole issue of improved seeds, pesticides, and so on. Okay? So what would you say to that?
Okay. When I talk about petty production, I have in mind a very large sector. You just go out into the streets of Dar es Salaam and you see massive amount of petty trade, massive amount of petty production. In fact, the bulk of the nation's population is engaged in that kind of thing. Now, does that petty production remain, or do, let's say, Walmart and other such agencies come in? Do we have malls displacing petty traders? Do we have new kinds of mass manufactured goods displacing handicraft production? There's a huge mass of people engaged in this, who, if you allow freedom to capitalism to encroach upon them, would actually simply get displaced. And there would be no way of absorbing them. Now, coming to traditional agriculture, a lot of the things which multinational corporations could provide by way of better seeds and so on can also be provided by the state. In other words, the thing about the state is that the state ultimately is run by a government that's elected. Therefore, in some sense, that government is accountable to the people in a way that multinational corporations are not accountable to the people. Whenever you have multinational corporations confronting petty producers, typically what tends to happen is that all the risks are passed on to the petty producers. For instance, if the world market prices collapse, in that case you find that the peasants get collapse. If the world market prices shoot up, then the peasants' prices don't shoot up. Right. So you have a situation where the peasantry in such situations gets into debt in bad price years, in other words, when their prices are low. And therefore, over a period of time, its conditions of living become worse and worse. Now, if instead of multinational corporations, you actually had the state, I'm assuming for the time being that equal impact in terms of efficiency or in terms of labor displacement, etc. If you had the state coming in, then the state would make sure that the peasantry is not squeezed in this manner through the impact of world market price fluctuations. So even if you think of multinational corporations at their best, namely they don't displace labor, even then it is better to have state intervention rather than multinationals. Better to have the state providing better seeds than multinationals providing better seeds and so on.
What you are saying is very interesting, because in Tanzania we have some experience of what are known as outgrowers schemes. We had very large sugar plantation in Kilombero, and when it was privatized, the private people who came in, of course they had to deal with the workers there, strikes and so on. Now they went for this scheme, even settling some of the workers on so-called their own land to grow sugar. But the quality of the sugar they buy and the grading is all done by them. Right. So you have to produce certain type of sugar. And you're absolutely right. When the prices went down, actually the peasants suffered.
I want to ask a very simple question. We keep reading in newspapers about world coffee prices collapsing from time to time. Right. Have you ever heard of Nescafe prices collapsing in the retail market? Of course not. So obviously the coffee growers are getting less, but on the other hand, the margins are increasing as far as the middlemen, as far as the multinationals are concerned, as far as the marketing agencies are concerned. So bad price years are bad price years only for the peasants.
Right, you're right. And what is interesting, in this particular case that I just cited to you, actually they killed two birds with a stone. Because what happened now, they reduced the labor force, okay? And within overnight, our plantation workers union collapsed, because they could no longer get subscriptions.
Absolutely.
Because the company would say, these people are not employed by us. You see, they're employed by outgrowers.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
You see?
Yes.
So the union collapsed.
Yes.
This is one of our strongest
Exactly.
unions.
Yes.
But they could not get subscriptions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think it's very interesting, some of these schemes which on the face of it look attractive, but they do not resolve our problems. And the other thing about providing seeds and pesticides and so on, again we have an experience, because the multinationals which are coming in are some of the most notorious multinationals like Monsanto, and we know what is the effect of. It creates a kind of seed dependence.
Absolutely.
It creates a seed dependence.
Every year they have to go back
That's
to buy
right.
the seeds. And what is more, if you buy their seeds, those seeds are pesticide prone. You have to buy the pesticides from them. So they really get a grip as far as the peasant is concerned.
Right. Now, but let me now come to the alternative. It's not sufficient to criticize this model. What kind of alternative model that one could propose where the small production, while not being displaced, but at the same time they can reap the benefits of economies of scale, and also improve their implements, the technology and so on, tractors, irrigation, machines and so on.
Yes, I think this would require cooperativization on a voluntary basis among the small producers, because only then can the scale be increased, and only then whatever economies of scale there are can actually be reaped. And in particular, as you are saying, many of the implements which they can use, they cannot afford individually, and it may not be economical individually, but if you have a larger scale of cultivation, then it becomes economical. This larger scale, I'm suggesting, is to be ensured not through capitalist farming, but through cooperativization among the small and petty producers. And of course, this would require support from the state. It's very important that the state should step in to prevent capitalist encroachment into the petty production sector, but instead to also encourage cooperativization on a voluntary basis among the small producers, including the peasantry.
So when you talk about cooperatives among the peasants, in Tanzania we are used to marketing cooperatives. But I gather from what you have been speaking that your concept of cooperatives was beyond that.
Yes. I would say that we can start anywhere. We can start with marketing cooperatives. move on to credit cooperatives. The same cooperative, which is a marketing cooperative, can convert itself into a credit cum marketing cooperative. And on the basis of that kind of cooperation, we could even move on to cooperative farming. I had in mind, when I was talking about economies of scale, where, let's say, implements are involved, which can be used only on a minimum amount of land to be economical, will have to have an increase in the size of the cultivated area, and that can come about through cooperative farming. But I'm saying that we don't have to rush into cooperative farming. Basically, through various forms of cooperation, we can actually ultimately move to a situation where there can be cooperative farming as well through the voluntary pooling of land.
Right. And also, because there's another very important constraint on small production is credit. And no agriculture anywhere in the world can survive without credit. And the traditional wisdom is that, the only way small production can get credit from the banks is by a collateral. And therefore you must register and issue titles to small peasants to get credit from commercial banks. Now that does not happen anywhere in the world. It doesn't happen, we know. No commercial bank will advance credit on a 2 or 4 or 5 or even 20 acre farm. So again, how do we sort of see possibility of cooperatives being able to finance?
You see, for instance, what you find, I can talk on the basis of the Indian experience, that many banks now, what they do is that they say, we are not going to directly enter into a relationship with the peasantry. What we need is what they call facilitators, that we give a loan to somebody, he can go and give a loan to the peasants. But then these facilitators become middlemen who really obtain loan cheap and give it at much higher interest rates to the peasants. They are a new class of usurious money lenders. But suppose this loan actually came through the cooperative. Suppose it's a cooperative society, which of course cooperative credit societies would be pooling credit from among their members. But additionally, they can actually access credit from the institutional structure, namely the banking system, and give it out to the peasants. In which case, you give up this middleman and you have a situation where the peasants get credit cheap. And also there's a pooling of risk because, an individual peasant's crop may fail in a particular year. His father may fall ill or something of that kind. But on the other hand, if you have a large scale, a large number of clients where the risks are pooled, then that does not pose a threat to either the individual peasant or certainly not to the cooperative.
Right. And you can have cooperative banks.
Absolutely.
Where the state can have a certain share. And the National Cooperative Society can also have a share.
Yes.
And cooperative banks may not, we have some experience in Tanzania about it, need not ask for land as collateral.
No.
Because in Tanzania, for example, in the 50s and so on, the credit was given on the basis of what is called floating charge on the product. Because then your loan is paid through when you sell your...
Absolutely, yes. They can give loans on the basis of the crops rather than the asset.
Let me move on from that to planning. There are two questions which arose in my mind. First, contrary to expectations, you did not talk a lot about techniques of planning, but you located planning within a bigger social economic context. Okay, that's number one. And number two, maybe to start with, before you answer that, if you could sort of elaborate a little more on the whole concept of planning, because there is budgetary planning, there is project planning, and there is material planning. So when you talk about planning in the socio-economic context, planning to advance development in the interest of the large majority, what type of planning are we really talking?
Yes, I think, planning began in the Soviet Union when there was an enormous amount of stress on the internal consistency of the plan. Therefore, technical questions like input-output analysis, balances between different sectors, optimal technique, programming exercises and so on, were in the forefront of the discussion. Now, we are talking about, so if you like, the preoccupation with the technical aspects of planning is really something which is a part of the Soviet experience. When we are talking about countries like Kerala, for instance, I mean, you can have, you are operating broadly within a framework in which governments can change. You're operating within a framework. Of course, Kerala is a particular state. It doesn't even have to match things. But you're operating within a framework in which you can always import and export, unlike the Soviet Union, which is completely isolated, completely, as it were, shut off from the rest of the world. We're not talking about that. More important than the technical aspects, it seems to me, is to actually have a certain, I mean, two things become important. First is to have a trajectory of development which benefits the people. And second is to have a degree of social and political consensus around it. Because in the absence of that, you have one trajectory of development on which you have embarked, but on the other hand, tomorrow a different government comes, they have a different trajectory, in which case, obviously, there is internal sort of, inconsistency and problems. But if you have a trajectory of development, let us say, like we were just now talking about whether the trajectory of development should be one in which the state supports petty production and cooperativization and so on. That is our strategy. That is the path on which we are moving. Now, I think around that there has to be sufficient consensus so that today we form cooperatives, tomorrow another government comes in and that doesn't kind of destroy the cooperatives. So there has to be, I think, those aspects of planning, namely the strategy of moving forward and getting some kind of a consensus around this strategy, become very important in our context.
Right. So in that case, the consensus works across the spectrum.
Well, the way I would put it is the following, that all political parties need not be agreed. But I think there has to be a sufficient awareness among the people, a sufficient consciousness among the intelligentsia, a sufficient consciousness among those who, let's say, are opinion makers, or, Lenin would have called vanguard, In other words, among the thinkers. If you have that, then that puts an implicit pressure even on the political formations that they cannot deviate too much. So when I'm talking about consensus, I don't mean all parties agreeing to it. I mean consensus in the sense that the people at large think this is a good idea. Okay. And also consensus in the sense that, that let's say the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, the kind of thinkers in society and so on, they all also think this is a good idea. If that is the case, then I think the political parties also feel constrained to break away from that consensus.
So basically, I think what we are saying is that, first of all, one should be clear on the trajectory of development, at least in its broad outline and details, and then try to mobilize consensus around that trajectory of development. So we know, all of us, where we are going, what is our vision, and who will be the real agents of development that we want to bring out, and who will be the beneficiaries of the development.
I see planning not as a small group which is doing some fantastically important technical exercise, shut off from the rest of society and telling society what is the best way. I see planning more as a conversation between the planners, those who have been put in charge of planning and who have been entrusted this task of working out a certain strategy of forward advance, and the people at large, and society at large. So I see planning as a sort of conversation on the basis of which the best path actually emerges.
Professor,
Completely free of.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.